Honorable Butale, honorable ministers, both in the room and joining us virtually, distinguished delegates, my executive director representing Botswana in the African Development Bank, and all the senior officials, please allow me to stand on established protocols. I bring you warm greetings from Dr. Kingumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group. Let me use this opportunity to congratulate you, Mr. President, for your resounding win in an election that brings you in as the sixth president of the Republic of Botswana. I commend the people of Botswana for the historic 2024 elections, which is an outstanding demonstration of democracy in practice. Congratulations for being a shining light for Africa and the world. I thank you, Mr. President, for hosting this year's African Economic Conference in this beautiful and historic city of Gaborone. The theme of the conference, Securing Africa's Economic Future Amidst Rising of Uncertainty, is both timely and critical at this stage in Africa's and global development discourse. And holding this conference in Botswana at this time is also a big signal that Africa can actually secure its own future. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we live at a time when the recurrent and overlapping shocks to global, regional, and national economies have forced increased realization of the need for reforms at all scales. We need reforms in how we conceive and implement global governance. We need reforms in multilateralism and global finance architecture. We need reforms in the principles of international cooperation, economic development policy at both regional and national scales. We need reforms in how we harness the different forms of capital for economic development in Africa. And this includes natural capital, human capital, social capital, our cultures, and institutional capital. We need to involve our youths and women in public policy and leadership in order to harness their innovativeness, restlessness, and creativity. The list could go on. But if you look at years of development practice, it has now become very evident that current development paradigms have served the world a great deal, but it has also left a number of inequalities, especially in Africa. The rates of economic diversification and structural transformation across the African continent remain low and uneven. While several African countries have achieved high rates of growth, in their gross domestic product, the rates of growth in per capita incomes have remained far too low to create the necessary jobs that Africa needs to have sustainable livelihoods for everyone. Levels of unemployment therefore remain unacceptably high, and majority of African citizens continue to be locked in low productivity sectors. And the rate of poverty is deepening in several African countries. According to the African Economic Outlook Report 2024, employment share of manufacturing sector in Africa increased only by 0.6% between 1990 and 2018. And at current growth rates, close to 9 out of 10 of the world's extremely poor people will be in Africa by 2030. Most middle-income African countries could remain stuck in the middle-income trap for decades to come, and it could take African countries more than a century, on average about 108 years, to transition to a high-income status. Ladies and gentlemen, you agree with me that this is not acceptable. Speaking here in Botswana, one of Africa's shining examples of sound democracy, with one of the highest human development index in Africa at 0.71 in 2022, and per capita incomes of over $7,000 in 2023, there is hope for Africa. Yet, more needs to be done to address youth unemployment and income inequality, even in Botswana. In this regard, the new youthful government that you have put together, Your Excellency, Mr. President, is a significant opportunity to create jobs for youths and improve income equality and distribution of wealth across Botswana. Another shining example for Africa. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, addressing these persistent uncertainties requires a multifaceted approach. First, it calls for a fundamental rethinking of the underpinning models of global governance, economic development policy, and new innovations in economic diplomacy and multilateralism. Second, it calls for homegrown solutions embedded in local realities. And I would like to repeat, homegrown solutions embedded in local realities. African countries need to realize now more than ever, especially after hearing the issues around trade protectionism, the challenges around multilateralism that is going on, and calls for reforms everywhere. We need to recognize that national development cannot be outsourced. Development is a do-it-yourself business. Third, it calls for effective collaboration and equal partnerships amongst development institutions, countries, and national governments, the private sector, and citizens everywhere. To be sustainable, the development process must be inclusive, proactively harnessing all forms of capital, especially human and natural capital, with a laser focus on beneficiation and value addition. It calls for reforms of the global debt and tax architecture to make it more transparent, flexible, accessible, and affordable for developing countries. It calls for policy coherence in all sectors. And the list can go on. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the African Economic Conference provides that leading platform for African economists, policymakers, and leaders to think together and craft solutions to the continent's recurrent and emerging economic challenges and opportunities. This year's conference, holding here in Botswana, provides a golden opportunity for us to review critically Africa's development experience, our participation in the global governance structures, and our internal economic governance practices and principles to find solutions that are relevant for Africa, in Africa, by Africans to move Africa forward. Africa needs to respond to these growing and overlapping uncertainties with a resolve to turn them into opportunities for homegrown policies that builds resilience, leveraging its own resources and emerging technologies to build back bolder, bigger, and better. Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, Africa can build and strengthen its own fiscal buffers and address the perennial challenges posed by the global debt markets that have ingrained debt sustainability challenges in Africa's DNA. Experiences have demonstrated that by boosting domestic revenue mobilization, strengthening macroeconomic policy frameworks, countries can make their domestic as well as regional financial systems more resilient. Second, we need to learn from growth contractions that result from uncertainties, especially when these challenges do come, as they always do come. Some of these contractions come from increased misallocation of capital across sectors in those uncertain times. We need to refocus on fiscal discipline, improve the capacity in public financial management, and facilitate more efficient resource allocation that spur growth, both in good and lean times. For example, structural reforms to promote domestic and foreign direct investments can help lower borrowing costs and reduce funding needs in countries. Third, strategic pro-innovation industrial policy reforms with a right policy mix can help boost factor productivity, manufacturing value added, and inclusive growth in countries. tried and tested policies such as local content, franchising policies, and preferred procurement could go a long way in boosting investments in value chains of competitive advantages in countries and create jobs for everyone, boosting economic productivity. We must try to stem the leakages from African economies. This continent loses about 1.6 billion US dollars every day from poor governance and poor regulatory frameworks. To secure our economic futures, therefore, we must think outside the box. We must find innovative new ways that are African, that addresses Africa's challenges. I therefore call on us to really think outside the box, using the core principles of our disciplines, but also learning from Africa's cultures and experiences to come up with solutions that address Africa's challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa can do that. From the examples of growth in Botswana, it is possible that Africa can sustain high growth, good quality of lives, good governance, and be able to forge ahead. To conclude, I thank you, Mr. President, and the people of Botswana for the warm hospitality extended to us since we arrived in this beautiful city of Gaborone. And I must say, for your visionary leadership and bold leadership, which holds lots of promise, not only for the people of Botswana, but also for Africa and the world at large. Mr. President, with your kind of resolved leadership example, the youthful government you have put together, and commitment to rule of law and human rights, Africa has hope to secure its future. Thank you, Mr. President.